Welcome, IT changemakers, to the DEX Show with Tim Flower and Tom McGraw. Let's get into it.
So hello, everybody. Welcome to what we're calling Jacob Morgan's Leadership Guide, hosted by Tim Flower and myself. We are the co-hosts of the DEX Show, as you may already know. And when our friends in the ambassadors team, John and Charlotte, invited us to host this event, we did immediately think of that theme leadership, precisely for the reasons that John just articulated, that a leader is not just somebody who manages people or who runs a team. A leader is somebody who drives innovation in their organization, who's willing to implement change, take risks. And we absolutely know that the ambassador community in total is a community of leadership, of leaders rather, in that exact sense. And as soon as we thought of that theme and that topic, I immediately thought of our very special guest, Jacob Morgan. He's somebody whose recent work in particular is really synonymous with that theme of leadership. His most recent book, Leading with Vulnerability, Unlock Your Greatest Superpower to Transform Yourself, Your Team, and Your Organization, is out now. And all of our value community members joining us today, you will all be receiving, if you haven't already, I'm not up to date with where this is in the post, but a signed copy of that book. And happily, Jacob is also synonymous with theme of experience. He's written extensively on and brilliantly on employee experience, and we've had him on the podcast before to discuss that. So we thought he would be an absolutely fantastic guest, and we will welcome Jacob and get stuck in momentarily. We're going to chat for about 30 minutes about the theme of leadership, particularly and specifically within the technology space. And then we're going to have a bit of an open session where people can ask questions, they can turn their mics off, they can say hello, or they can put questions in the chat as we go, and they'll be read out at the end of the discussion. Just want to mention that we are looking forward to releasing this as a special DEX Show episode in 2025. So if for any reason you don't want your name or your voice on the show, just let us, and you still have a question, just let us know and we'll make sure we edit you out of that final cut. But otherwise, we hope for lots of engagement and we're sure of a fantastic discussion. So with that, after that prolonged intro, let me finally welcome Jacob to the presentation. Hi, Jacob. Great to see you. How you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me. Good to see everybody.
Excellent, excellent. And we're really delighted that you were able to do this. Thank you so, so much. And let's start with your most recent book, Leading with Vulnerability. What inspired you to write it, and what unique perspective do you feel it brings to the wider discussion of leadership in general?
Well, I think a lot of people are familiar with the concept of vulnerability. We've all heard about it. We all know what it means. The challenge that I noticed with a lot of leaders specifically, and this even came about when I was writing a previous book called The Future Leader, is that a lot of leaders, whether they're CEOs or mid-level leaders inside of organizations, were really trying to figure out, well, what kind of a leader am I supposed to be? Am I supposed to be the type of a leader who acknowledges challenges and failures and shortcomings? Or am I supposed to be the kind of a leader that seems to have it all figured out, that has a vision and a plan and a strategy, who leaders can come to, or who employees can come to for guidance? And a lot of these people that I was interviewing were very conflicted, because employees on the one hand were saying, well, we want you to acknowledge your failures and challenges and say, I don't know, but we also want you to be strong and confident and competent. So how do you kind of combine both those things together? And so what I realized over time is that while a lot of leaders understand the concept of vulnerability, what a lot of people fail to understand is that vulnerability in your personal life is not the same as it is inside of your organization. Because in your personal life, you're vulnerable to connect with your spouse, your significant other, friends, family. But inside of your company, there's a different dynamic. You have a team, you have customers, you have a project, you have deadlines, you're being paid a salary, you have leaders, maybe you have people who work for you. And so being vulnerable in that kind of a context is not the same as it is in your personal life. And the really interesting insight that I came about from all of this is what I tell everybody is don't be vulnerable at work. Lead with vulnerability instead. And so the difference between those two things is that vulnerability is about acknowledging a gap that you have. It could be a gap in competence. It could be a gap in experience, a gap in knowledge, whatever it is. But if you simply show up to work every day acknowledging the gaps that you have, a lot of people are going to look at you and they're going to say, well, maybe you shouldn't be in this job. Maybe this isn't a good fit. Maybe, you shouldn't be doing the work that you're doing. Leading with vulnerability, on the other hand, is about acknowledging a gap that you have and then demonstrating what you're trying to do to close the gap. And that's a big difference, because now instead of simply saying, hey, I don't know how to do this, or I need help, you're demonstrating how you're trying to solve the problem, what you're trying to do to get better, to close that gap. And when you're able to do that, the perception that other people have around you very much changes. So the really kind of the simple insight from everything, and the one thing that I hope everybody remembers, is leadership plus vulnerability equals leading with vulnerability. Leadership plus vulnerability. So let me just give you a simple example, and then I'll stop there and see if you have any questions. So a very simple example might be if you're, your leader, your boss comes over to you and asks you to do something, a project, a task, whatever it might be, and you mess up. And being vulnerable in that situation would be going to your leader and saying, hey, I'm really sorry. I know how important this was. I screwed up and I'm sorry. Now, we've all been in that situation where either you've been the person that has made the mistake, or somebody has come to you and told you that they have made the mistake. And in none of those situations does everybody always say, gee, thank you for telling me. Everybody always wants to know, well, okay, what are you going to do about it? The customer is still unhappy. The project has still not been completed. We're still behind schedule. You're telling me you made this mistake, but what are you going to do? And so in that situation, that's simply being vulnerable. Leading with vulnerability would be taking that same example and saying, hey, I know how important this was. I'm really sorry. I made a mistake. I screwed up. Here's what I learned from the mistake that I made. Here's what I'm going to do to make sure that that mistake doesn't happen again. And here's some things that I'm putting into place to fix that mistake that I've made. Now, let me know what you think. That's very different than simply saying, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. And that is a very, very key insight and a key differentiating factor between simply being vulnerable versus leading with vulnerability. And I think anybody in a current or aspiring leadership role, whether you're in IT, whether you're in marketing or sales, whatever it might be, if you can simply remember that concept of not just exposing the gap, but demonstrating what you're trying to do to close the gap, I think you'll see a lot more success in terms of your personal career growth and also team dynamics.
I wonder, Jacob, if I could just chip in here before handing the questions over to Tim, who I know has a follow-up there. I've heard in the past from two kind of very successful people in the course of my career the same adage, and it was never explain, never apologize. And I have to say, as an Englishman, that comes very unnaturally, Jacob. We apologize 6, 7 times a day at least. But I just wonder if that's indicative of a kind of an outmoded workplace culture, what you think that indicates and what you think has changed to make that kind of mentality outmoded in particular.
You mean just simply apologizing and saying, I'm sorry?
Just the idea that it seemed to be more prevalent maybe in previous generations that apologizing was a sign of weakness. Full stop.
Well, yes, yeah. So one of the things that I did for the book is I surveyed 14,000 employees around the world, and this was done in partnership with a leadership firm called DDI, which some people might be familiar with. And we asked these 14,000 employees, what's the number one thing that keeps you from being vulnerable at work? And the number one response was, I don't want to be perceived as being weak or incompetent.
Right.
And so the way that you solve that problem is you add competence to the vulnerability.
Got it.
Right? That it's very different to say, I'm sorry, or I made a mistake, versus demonstrating what you're trying to do to close the gap. And so the answer to that question is in the question itself. If you don't want to be perceived as being weak or incompetent, then add the competence and the strength to the vulnerability. And if people can focus on that, they're going to see that the perception that others have of them changes dramatically.
So
in a sense, I agree with that. I mean, simply just saying, I'm sorry, I made a mistake doesn't, in the context of work and business, doesn't do much. It doesn't help anything. I mean,
Sure.
It's good to have the psychological safety to acknowledge the mistake, but at the same time, simply acknowledging the mistake doesn't move anything forward. In the context of work, your team, your leaders, your peers, your customers still want to know what you're trying to do to close the gap, right? To solve the problem. Mm-hmm. If you've ever had any experiences with customer service representatives, if you have an issue with Amazon or Wayfair, whoever it might be, you never want the person on the other line to just say, I'm sorry, the product came late. I'm sorry it came damaged. Like, thank you for calling. No, it's, well, oh, I'm so sorry that came late. Here's what we're going to do to solve the problem for you. We're going to give you 20% off your order. Oh, I'm so sorry it came damaged. We're going to reship it to you for free, and we'll give you a $100 credit on your next order. Like, we want to know what is being done to solve the problem. The same thing is true inside of any organization for employees.
And Jacob, I think that connects the dots really well. It's all about admitting that problem, admitting that mistake, but getting people to follow you as a leader to the solution. Here's what we're going to do to solve it. Here's what we're going to do to fix it. I'm curious, the new book obviously tackles some new material, some very important material. How does it complement your previous work, particularly in that broader context of employee experience and leadership? How does this connect the dots for us to some of your previous work?
I think it's very much related. So the previous books I wrote the one right before this one was The Future Leader. I have a new book that will come out next year. It doesn't have a title yet, but it's going to be building on the concepts of the employee experience book, which came out in 2017. But a lot has changed since 2017 when we think about employee experience. So I'm doing an update to that because it's been, almost a decade. So they all kind of complement on each other because leading with vulnerability is how you create better leaders, right? And a lot of our experience at work, a lot of the engagement that we have at work, a lot of how we feel about ourselves at work comes from the leaders that we work with. And in the research that we did, we found that from all the leadership behaviors and attributes and characteristics that make a great leader, the things that leaders are most uncomfortable with and do least frequently is acknowledge mistakes and failures and show a willingness to be emotionally vulnerable at work.
Right.
So it's very difficult to work. And I have friends like this. I'm sure we all have friends like this, where they just refuse to be vulnerable in any kind of way. It makes it very difficult to create any kind of connection or bond or relationship. And so the reason why you need both of those things and how this builds on experience and how this builds on leadership is that think about kind of like an XY axis. Let's say you're really only good at the leadership, the competence piece. You're really, really good at your job. And, I might come to one of your employees and say, hey, what do you think of so-and-so? And they'll say, oh man, this person's just really great at their job. They're able to bring in money. They're super smart, but we just don't have that chemistry. The relationship is not quite there. I don't feel as engaged and empowered in the work that I'm doing, but they're really good at what they do, but we just don't have that kind of chemistry. Similarly, let's say you are really good at the vulnerability piece, the connection piece, but you struggle with the leadership or the competence piece. And again, I go to one of your employees and say, what do you think of so-and-so? They'll say, oh, well, we have this great relationship. We have this great connection. We're able to collaborate. So-and-so is a really great person. But I don't know if they're the best leader for the job because they're not really able to demonstrate that competence piece. They're not able to, to bring in business. They're not able to kind of set that vision or anything like that. But I like working for this person. And so this is why you need both. You need to work with and for leaders who are both competent and are demonstrating that they're good at their job, and who also are able to create that connection and build those relationships with their employees. And that's where the leading with vulnerability component comes in. I mean, simply put, leadership plus vulnerability, think about it, competence plus connection. The two most important aspects for any leaders, competence and connection.
And leaders learn from other leaders. As Tom continues to remind me, I have a lot of years behind me in my career. I've seen a lot of leaders in action, both in public and in private settings. I've learned what to do and what to emulate from them, but I've also learned what not to do. You recognize bad leadership sometimes even more than you recognize good leadership. And you've worked extensively on defining what makes a great leader. How do you personally define leaders specifically in IT? Because they don't necessarily have to be managers of people, right?
Yeah. So there are a lot of different ways that you can think about how to define leadership. I mean, in my book, The Future Leader, and you're quizzing me here on my exact definition that I used. It was something along the lines of a leader is somebody who can, paint a vision of a better scenario, can rally employees to move in the direction of that better vision or scenario that they've created, and do so in a human way. And so that's kind of how I think about leaders. The visual that I use is a lighthouse. And it might sound a little bit cliche, but if you think about the whole purpose of a lighthouse, it's to guide others to safety and to success. And so to be a lighthouse, what that means is that you need to build yourself up, right? You need to learn new skills, learn new attributes, embrace new mindsets. But if you don't have any ships in the water, a lighthouse is pointless because who are you guiding? So not only are you building yourself up, but the most important aspect of leadership is to guide those around you, to teach those around you the things that you yourself are learning. And this, I think, is a very, very important aspect of leadership that sometimes we forget. And so, I mean, that's at least my favorite way to think about leadership. You also mentioned something else about learning, which I think is a very, very important point to bring up too, because there's no learning without vulnerability, right? I mean, if you don't acknowledge gaps that you have, you're basically saying that I'm perfect. And so you can't get better, you can't learn unless you acknowledge that you have a gap somewhere, right? And again, I'm sure we all have friends or family members or coworkers who refuse to acknowledge any gaps that they have. They kind of assume that, like, I'm great, I'm perfect. It's very hard to work with those types of people. Very hard to have relationships with those types of people. So if you want to become a better version of you, you cannot do that without first acknowledging, hey, yeah, you're right. I do need to get better in certain areas. And here's how I'm going to get better in those areas.
Right.
So an important part of learning and growing and developing in any kind of a way is vulnerability. You can't have that without the other.
So we're actually in a unique scenario today. We've got a really robust audience consisting largely of technology leaders, people who may or may not lead teams, but certainly drive innovation in their organizations. I'm curious what trends in IT you're seeing, and what do you think the most important trends are right now and relevant and aligned to those themes in your book?
Well, there's leadership trends and technology trends, right? When we think about leadership as a concept, I don't think it really matters whether you're in IT or sales or marketing. A lot of the behaviors, the mindsets, the attributes, the concepts of leading with vulnerability are the same, regardless of industry, regardless of geography. I mean, we surveyed 14,000 employees, talked to over 100 CEOs at companies around the world, and the themes were very consistent across the board. I always say that I think the two coolest roles in inside of any organization today are HR and IT. Those are the two most interesting roles for a number of reasons, because I think when we think about the future of work, those are the two functions that are kind of powering all these things going forward. And they're also the two functions that I think need to spend the most time working and collaborating and talking with each other, but they don't. And so from the context of IT, I'm sure everybody here would acknowledge that probably the big thing that your respective organization is thinking about is probably something related to AI or security, things like ChatGPT, implementing these things inside of your organization. At least this has been the most consistent theme that I have seen across IT professionals. Is really around security. It's really around driving these types of collaborative tools and platforms. And of course, it's really about how do we infuse AI into pretty much any and all aspects of how we get work done. Easier for some companies than others, right? Some are regulated by the government. Some don't have the luxury of simply using something like a ChatGPT. They have to build their own. That creates its own challenges. Data and how do you make sure that you have accurate data that IT teams can use to make sure that these AI tools are useful to begin with is another challenge that I'm seeing inside of a lot of organizations. But I think it's actually a pretty cool time to be in the world of IT because the challenges are very complex, they're very big, and if they can get figured out, the impact is massive.
I'm going to have to apologize, Jacob, because I think we structured this as we were going to leave some time for questions at the end. But we've had such a flood of interactions that I thought I would just drop a couple in as we go to make sure that none get missed out by the end. So that's my solution to the apology. I hope I'm leading with vulnerability here. And the first question is, from John Brooks, where does time fit into the equation? If you recognize there is a gap, then how long should you give yourself to prove that you can shrink the gap?
Well, I guess it depends on what the gap is. The gaps can be small, they could be large. A small gap might be something like, how you respond to an employee in a certain situation. A gap might be, I'm being asked to do this really big project and I'm in way over my head. I have no idea how to do this. And I'm going to need a week or 2 weeks or several weeks to kind of get up to speed on what I'm supposed to be doing here. So I think the time should be in proportion to whatever the gap is. And again, these things can be small. These things can also be, very large. Like I've had situations even with friends or even with people that I work with on my team where they might say, they might give me feedback on how I communicate about something and say, hey, it would be better if you did this instead of that. And so, part of what I need to do is, acknowledge and say, yeah, you're right. I didn't know that that's how it came across, and I'm going to make sure to fix that going forward. So that's, a very quick thing. And the next time we're communicating or collaborating, I kind of change the process that I use, right? That's very different than, if I'm in IT and somebody comes over to me and says, hey, we want to implement some generative AI tool, go figure out how to make it work inside of our company. And that's a huge gap that's going to take, weeks or months. So again, the time I think is in proportion to what that gap is. But that's probably the best answer I can give on that without knowing more.
Understood. And yeah, the point was made that, on a technical level of responsibility, timing is quite important, and that's going to quite often. So that's going to depend, isn't it, from circumstance to circumstance. We'll come back to those questions shortly. Do keep dropping them in the chat. Some really good ideas going there already. But so question about technological change, Jacob. What role do IT leaders, in your view, have in shaping workplace culture, particularly to align with new tools and workflows in today's environment of continuous change?
So as far as how IT specifically impacts culture, well, I think there are a couple of things there. One, IT has this tremendous opportunity to collaborate with HR teams to shape culture, because part of creating culture inside of an organization is not just kind of on the leadership side, but it's also the tools that employees are using, right? The resources they have access to do their jobs. And so if the tools that employees are using are enabling things like flexible work, they're enabling real-time feedback and collaboration, that dramatically changes the culture of the company, right? As opposed to when employees are using tools that make it difficult for them to work and they have to log into multiple different places and information's getting lost and they're duplicating each other's work and it doesn't enable flexible work or real-time collaboration and feedback. Then the culture, you can easily see, changes dramatically. And we also need to remember that when people have a problem with technology, it's not just an IT problem, it's very much a human problem, right? I mean, if you're at home or if you're at work and you have an issue with Wi-Fi or you're trying to log into something, you get a human response, right? You get frustrated, you get angry, you get disengaged. And so although we typically assume of IT people as the ones who are supposed to solve those problems, the feelings that we get are human feelings. So IT is very much a human aspect of work. It's not just about the technology piece. It's really about how we're impacting the lives of employees and how they're working. Because all of the work that we get done is as a result of technology. I mean, any aspect of work, pretty much at any company. I mean, I always like to say that every company today is a technology company, right? Anything that you do, collaboration, communication, feedback, performance reviews, surveys, engagement surveys, learning and development, you mean anything is as a result of technology that employees are accessing. And so you can imagine if your experience is using some outdated old piece of technology that's complicated, how is that going to change the culture versus if you're using something that feels like Zoom or that you're using Google or that you're using something, that you might use in your personal life. And so I always say that the three things that employees care about most when it comes to technology, it's the acronym ACE. A, which is accessibility to everybody. C is consumer grade instead of enterprise grade. And let me unpack what that means when I say consumer grade versus enterprise grade. So there used to be a time, and I'm sure a lot of you here on this Zoom call can remember, where enterprise grade technology was kind of like the standard that we always talked about. And really that meant it's big, it's clunky, it's super secure, it's bulletproof, and it's very difficult to use. That's how a lot of consumers, employees think of enterprise grade technology. Consumer grade is something that's so useful, so beautiful, so valuable that you would consider using it in your business life if it existed. So think of Zoom, Google, ChatGPT, Dropbox, Facebook, LinkedIn. These tools are so easy to use. They're so valuable that if something like that existed at work, you would love to use those types of platforms. And how many employees are frustrated, not to rag on, necessarily SharePoint, but that used to be back in the day, the default platform that everybody would make fun of, right? SharePoint, information gets lost. I can't access it. Like what, right? It was so complicated and cumbersome to use some of these technologies and platforms that it hurt the culture of the company. So consumer grade is really something that models the tools and platforms that we're using in our personal lives at work. And the E stands for focusing on the employee needs instead of the business requirements. This was a very common challenge, and I think it still is, where oftentimes when companies want to deploy technology platforms, what do? They put together a checklist and they send the checklist over to IT and they say, help us find something or build something that has these things. And we kind of go through that checklist. The problem there is that we're not actually understanding how employees are using those tools. And there were lots of situations where technology or companies would deploy technology tools. They would meet the requirements as far as the checklist goes, but it would be so complicated and so cumbersome for employees to figure it out that the checklist was meaningless. In other words, we get so obsessed sometimes on the checklist and the requirements on the business side that we forget about focusing on who's actually going to be using those tools and platforms. And so this is why it's very, very important for IT professionals to pay attention not just to the checklist and the items that are required, but also how are employees actually going to use it. And I think that's a very, very important component on the technology side that impacts culture.
Great answer, Jacob. And
Hey, how's it going, guys?
I'm sorry, who was that? So someone want to chip in? They're very welcome to. Sorry, maybe somebody's just off mute accidentally for a moment. But so a couple of really great questions in the chat for you, Jacob. I want to just do them as a pair because I think they're related. First is from David Paul. I'm a leader with ADHD and neurodivergent brain. I found that it is more common to find neurodivergent people in IT. Have you ever looked at how neurodivergent people lead and how neurodivergent people need to be led? It is certainly different than the other 95% of the neurotypical population. What an interesting question. Puts you on the spot, Jacob. It's a bit off topic, but it is a good one.
I was actually diagnosed with ADHD as well when I was younger, so I can relate to that very much so. I've not specifically looked at that area, no. So I don't have a lot that I can share on that. I mean, obviously, I think for leaders, it's important to know who's on your team. And I think it's important to know who you're working with and how different employees prefer to communicate and engage and interact. I think if you treat all of your employees as kind of a one-size-fits-all approach as a leader, that's not very effective. So the most that I can say on that is that get to know your employees. If they have things like ADHD, have those open conversations and dialogue with them and say, okay, well, I understand that. What can I do as a leader to help make sure that you're more effective and successful? Like, what do you need from me? I think that's the right approach from leaders, is figuring out how do I serve my employees instead of assuming that employees are going to be there to serve them. But as far as the research side on how to be led, unfortunately, I didn't look that specific.
It's a great new book there, perhaps, Jacob. But perhaps related question from another good one from John Brooks. In your research, did you find there were differences in how vulnerability is perceived across different industries, regions, or cultures? And does a good leader, of course, acknowledge these differences in the context in which they function?
There was actually a lot of similarities. So from 14,000 employees, we looked at pretty much every industry that you can think of, most geographies around the world. And a lot of the data was very, very similar as far as the perception. I mean, there might have been some minor differences. I mean, off the top of my head, for some reason, what's coming out is like the construction industry, manufacturing. I feel like and I'd have to double check my big Excel spreadsheet here, but I believe that in those industries, vulnerability was a little bit more scarce than in other industries. Not necessarily by like huge, massive gaps, but there were some minor differences there. As far as around geographies, the difference there is in terms of the perception of vulnerability, but on how vulnerable people might be. So for example, if you go to a place like Japan or China, it's not that vulnerability there is not accepted or understood, but how vulnerable you might be and what you might be vulnerable about might be different as opposed to what you might be vulnerable about in Australia or the United States. So it's kind of a yes and no. Consistency across all geographies and industries is that vulnerability is important, acknowledged, respected, understood, is lacking, should be practiced more, people see the value of. As far as what you're going to be vulnerable about, that is a little bit different. That's why in the book I have these 5 vulnerable leader superheroes, where it kind of goes through and breaks down, some people are comfortable being vulnerable about different aspects. So there was a lot of consistency, which I was pretty surprised by.
Fantastic. And of course, you've, as I mentioned at the top of the discussion, a lot of your work has been around employee experience, sort of more broadly, and how have you seen the dynamic between DEX and EX evolve in recent years? And how do you see AI as potentially accelerating that interplay between them? And what advice would you have for the community here in terms of how to anticipate, embrace, and deploy AI in this kind of very conscientious fashion?
Okay, so there were a couple of questions there. What was the first part of that one?
More about the dynamic, first of all, between DEX and employee experience more generally. How have you seen this dynamic evolve in recent years?
So when you say DEX, what's the acronym?
Digital employee experience. You might not know it. Sorry. So that's kind of our specialism as an organization. So it's one of the reasons we're sort of so keen on that. So that's about the digital component of employee experience at large, effectively.
Got it. Okay, so you're talking about digital employee experience versus employee experience in general.
Yeah.
I mean, digital employee experience is a part of the overall employee experience. Employee experience is a combination of 3 things: culture, technology, and space. The tools and resources that employees have access to do their jobs, the spaces in which they work, whether it's in an office or whether it's, in a hybrid environment, and how employees feel doing the work that they're doing. So the digital aspect of that, sits within that realm of those three environments. And you can't have a great employee experience unless you are considering the digital aspect of the employee experience, because as we talked about earlier, the digital part is how work gets done. Without the digital aspect of employee experience, you don't get hybrid work, you don't get any of the stuff that is a part of what we call the future of work. So it's very much intertwined. I would definitely put the digital side, within those 3 environments, kind of the connective tissue of the overall employee experience. And what was the second part of the question?
It's about the influence of AI on that dynamic and on the workplace in general, and particularly as it's deployed by IT professionals.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting, the AI thing. So I have a private CHRO group that I run. We have 35 chief human resource officers from some of the world's top companies in there. And we actually had a meeting a few weeks ago around AI specifically. And the general consensus and feedback that everybody shared is that everybody is still very much in the early stages of AI. They're still trying to figure out where it fits, where it makes sense, how reliable and accurate it can be, what are the dangers of it, how at what scale should we be deploying it, what impact can it have. So it's a very, very interesting time to be playing around with AI. And I hear both good stories and bad stories. I've heard some stories of companies who use AI to screen resumes, to predict how successful an employee might be in a certain role. But I've also heard other stories of companies that use AI to do those same things, only to find that AI did a really poor job at predicting those things. And the big challenge is that these AI tools are only as good as the data that we feed into them. So for example, in the context of work, the big challenge is that employees are learning all the time, right? You might learn a new skill, you might learn how to code or program or develop something in your own personal time. You might read a book where you learn something new. Your tools at work don't know that, right? They don't know the new data, the new skills, the new things that you're learning that you can apply at work. So the big challenge is, how do we keep a real-time, up-to-date database of all the stuff that's happening inside of work so that AI can make sense of it and give you the right recommendations and feedback? And that is something that I think is a far bigger challenge to try to figure out than how to deploy AI. Because that is, as everybody on this call knows, the systems inside of organizations are so outdated. A lot of organizations out there don't even have an accurate real-time head count of how many employees work there, let alone the skills, the roles, the preferences, the career aspirations, the engagement scores, like what everybody's working on, where they want to go inside the company. So without having all of that, having an AI tool that's trying to predict things based on data that's not up to date is very, very hard. And so, I don't know what the solution to that is going to be. I think where a lot of people are seeing help with AI is kind of on the surface level stuff for now. So for example, I'm going to go into a performance review. I'm going to be interviewing so-and-so employee. Give me some great questions that I might be able to ask this employee to create a better relationship. Or, I'm in this kind of a role inside my company. So-and-so wants to move to this kind of another role. Help me develop a 6-month training roadmap of skills and courses of a timeline of what this employee should be doing to transition from, sales to IT. So it's good at giving, those types of, that type of guidance and feedback in general direction. But as far as how accurate it's going to be at some of the deeper aspects, I know there are a lot of case studies and things that are floating around outside from different vendors, but when I ask the actual CHROs who are responsible for this, a lot of them, in fact, I can't think of any of them who are like, oh yeah, with, massive success, we're all in on AI. Everyone is cautiously optimistic because they see that it's not quite as easy as we're making it sound.
Gotcha. We've got some brilliant questions coming, Jacob, and I know we haven't got so much time left, so I want us to get to those. And I'm going to begin by grouping two of them together because I think they both invite you to speak on the same theme, which is effectively confidence and at times a lack of confidence, as we all feel. So Alan Clackner asks, do you have any guidance around Oh, sorry, I just lost the question. Do you have any guidance around around risks of balancing loss of confidence if taking vulnerability too far or approaching in a way that's not compatible with a specific group? And John Brooks asks, for individuals struggling with imposter syndrome, the idea of being vulnerable might reinforce fears of inadequacy or of being found out. So how would you explain to them that vulnerability on its own does not make someone a great leader, and they strike that balance between openness and demonstrating their own competence?
Okay, I see this question here. I'm just going to quickly reread it. So, okay, imposter syndrome is, and I talk about that in the book as well. I think it's like a balance between openness and demonstrating their competence. So I'm trying to get to the core of the question, which is how would you explain to them that vulnerability on its own does not make someone a great leader, and how they can strike a balance between openness and demonstrating their competence? I would simply explain it in the sense of that vulnerability equation, right? Kind of the X and Y matrix that I talked about earlier. And I would explain to them and say, it's great to be vulnerable at work, that you have that psychological safety to do that. However, if you only focus on that aspect of work, people might perceive you as being weak or incompetent in that role. So here's what you can do to still use vulnerability, but to also make yourself look better, to change the perception that people have of you. Why don't you try adding this leadership piece? Give examples, tell stories. The book has tons of that stuff in there. There's crazy stories from CEOs that, you'll be very surprised. I know everyone's getting a copy of the book, that you'll be very surprised when you read them and see them. But it's really about getting to that message of combining competence with connection. It's helping people understand that as a leader, those are the two most important aspects of any leadership role. And it's also really interesting because it's hard to talk about this without mentioning in some way the impact that the last 3, 4, 5 years has had on work, especially during and post-pandemic. And, at that time, I would say that vulnerability was, up to a scale of 1 to 10, vulnerability was a 10, right? We were very good at checking in with each other, being vulnerable, being open. But as we moved out of the pandemic and as we, got back to a more normal speed of work, we kind of put the vulnerability up and the leadership down, right? For a lot of people, and I've seen this in many organizations, the vulnerability went up, right? The connection went way up and the competence took kind of a side seat inside of most organizations. And so it's kind of getting leveled out a little bit now. So I think 2025 is going to be a big year where we see a return and a big push towards the leadership, toward the competence piece. But I mean, the way, like I said, that I would talk about it is I would explain to any leader, the two most important aspects of your job are connecting with your people and demonstrating your leadership capabilities. You should not do one without the other. And I would talk about that leadership equation, the leading with vulnerability equation.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and here, so there was the inadequacy of being found out. If you add the competence to the vulnerability, you're not being found out about anything, right? If you only talk about the mistakes and challenges, then yeah, maybe there's a little bit about, being found out piece. But if you're demonstrating in front of your peers, in front of your leaders, in front of your coworkers that you're learning and growing and developing, what's there to be found out about? Now, I will say that there is an aspect of this where, we did a big survey, asked a lot of CEOs. At some point, vulnerability will be used against you. It will. And again, I have ridiculous stories in the book, but at some point, somebody will take something that you share and they will use it against you, either personally or professionally. Does that mean that you should never be vulnerable at work again? No. And this is very much true in all aspects of your life, right? At some point you have or will ask out somebody on a date and they're going to tell you no. Does that mean you should never do it again? At some point you're going to ask for a higher salary or a promotion at work and you're going to be told no. Should you never do it again? No. Same thing when we think about vulnerability. Yeah, at some point somebody will use it against you. The important thing to remember in that situation is, what did I learn about the person? What did I learn about the situation? And what did I learn about myself? So yes, there always is a little bit of that, well, I could say this and maybe somebody's going to use it against me, but the alternative is that you never do any of that and you fix yourself into a place of not developing and learning and growing and becoming a better version of you. That to me sounds like a much scarier place to be than dealing with potential repercussions of somebody might using vulnerability against you.
Superb. And I appreciate we're really running out of time, Jacob. If we can just get the last couple of questions here. Some really good comments from my friend Mike Kenny and from Matthew Butler here in the chat. But a couple of questions remaining as well. Alan Clackner says he's a huge fan of failure as an experience accelerator. With thoughtful review, there's rarely a delivery that doesn't have some room for improvement. However, the approach can be extremely fatiguing for a team, the continually moving of goalposts. Do you have any suggestions for celebrating progress in those areas of our team's area of vulnerability?
So recommendations for how to celebrate progress in areas of vulnerability? Is that,
Yeah.
I'm trying to scroll up. Who asked that question? Oh, I see, Alan.
Yeah.
Fan of failure is experience with thoughtful review. There's rarely a delivery that doesn't have some room for improvement. This approach can be extremely fatiguing for a team. How to celebrate progress in those areas of our team? I mean, acknowledge, right? I mean, they don't need to be formal things. Like if you have kids, for example, I have a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old. Whenever they exhibit behaviors that I think are worthy of praise, I say, great job. I'm really proud of you for doing that. So same thing inside of any organization. I mean, if you have an employee who comes to you and says, hey, Alan, I know I made this mistake, but look, here's what I learned from it. Here's what I'm going to do next time. And then Alan can simply go to his team and say, hey, everyone, I just really wanted to acknowledge, Tom on the team had some challenges in this project that he did, but he came to me with some great solutions. And I really love his initiative. I love that he was able to feel safe to come talk about this with me. And also that he was able to come up with a plan for how we can avoid this situation going forward. This is the type of behavior I love. And I would love it if everybody on the team can model after, Tom's example or something like that. So just acknowledging, highlighting those, telling stories around those, the impact, the outcomes of those. And most importantly, if you're a leader of a team, do that yourself. You lead by example, right? I mean, you be the one that goes out there and acknowledges and says, hey guys, that's a really great question. I'm not really sure what the answer is or what the best course of action is going forward, but here's what I'm going to try to do to figure it out. Let me get together with these people. Let's regroup in 3 to 5 days and I'll have some solutions and answers for you. Does that work for everybody? Great. So lead by example, demonstrate the behavior that you want others to have yourself. And then when those behaviors do come up, acknowledge, celebrate, reward, and talk about.
I'm so sorry. We still have questions coming in, and to Jim and Matthew, I'm so sorry for skipping this. I'm going to return to sort of the discussion point, because I think I'd like to end on a sort of general piece of advice and ask you one more question, if that's okay, Jacob. Just as a general piece of advice, we've got aspiring leaders in the digital employee experience space here with us. What opportunities should they seize, and what skills or traits do you think they need to focus on developing as they plan the next stage in their career? Maybe outside of the vulnerability competence nexus that we've been discussing.
So outside of that, you can Google, let me actually Google this and see if I can put this in here. So outside of that, there's a framework that I put together called the Notable 9. And if you just Google Notable 9 Jacob Morgan, and I'm going to try to put this in the chat here. This is from the previous book that I wrote called The Future Leader. And in that book, I talk about the 4 mindsets and the 5 most crucial skills that a lot of the world's top leaders identified as being most crucial for current and aspiring leaders. So if I were to go through something else, it would be that Notable 9 framework. And here I just found the article with the image. So I will put that into the chat here.
Fantastic. And we will put that in the show notes for anybody listening to this podcast. And
so yeah, that would be the one. And you can Google it and probably even find a better image than this one here, because we had a couple different versions of that. But those 4 mindsets and 5 skills outside of the leading with vulnerability piece, this is what 140 of the world's top CEOs said are the most crucial mindsets and skills for current and aspiring leaders for the next 5 to 10 years.
Superb. And if anybody, we also put in the show notes and in the chat here, links to your LinkedIn. Maybe if people tag you with a question, maybe that's another way they could follow up with this great discussion. And of course, everybody in this seminar with us today will be receiving a copy of that book, where I'm sure you go into some of these ideas and hopefully answer some of these questions in the course of your writing. Just remains for me to say thank you so much for leading this fascinating seminar, Jacob. Really, really appreciate you making the time. It was absolutely wonderful to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm pretty easy to find. If anybody has any additional questions or they want to reach out, I can put my email here, jacob@thefutureorganization.com. Anybody is more than welcome to reach out to me, and I'm pretty easy to find.
Superb. Thank you so much. And I should just say, for listeners to this podcast version of the recording, as it were, if you're thinking, what is this ambassadors program? If you happen to be a Nexthink customer and this is something you'd like to get involved with, as a sort of opportunity to get to know people in your sector, to share knowledge, to build your personal profile, and to participate in wonderful events such as this exclusive leadership seminar with Jacob Morgan. We will put a link to the ambassadors page in the show notes. If you follow that, you'll get in touch with our wonderful ambassadors team, and you can certainly join this thriving community. And just remains for me to thank all the ambassadors who've joined us today and who are maybe listening to the recording at a later date. We really, really appreciate your dedication and willingness to share your knowledge, for all your commitment across the course of 2024, and perhaps of some of you far before then. So I'm going to hand it back over now to Charlotte and John to sign us all out. But thank you for having me as well. And thank you for tuning in if you're listening to the podcast. And thank you, Jacob, once more. That was a wonderful discussion.
Thank you for having me.
To make sure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to leave a rating of the show. Just tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. If you'd like to learn more about how Nexthink can help you improve your digital employee experience, head over to nexthink.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.